The Council laughed at humanity until the stars fell. Silent Part 1. The station hung in space like a jewel against the darkness, and Jake Morrison could see it growing larger through the viewport as their shuttle approached, and he felt his stomach tighten with nervousness because this was the moment humanity had been working toward for decades, and everything depended on what happened in the next few hours. And beside him, Lisa Grant was reviewing her presentation notes for the 100th time while Admiral Peter Cross sat perfectly still with his hands folded and his face showing nothing at all. The shuttle docked with a soft thump and the airlock cycled open, and Jake stepped through first as protocol demanded, and the station interior took his breath away because it was massive beyond anything humanity had built, and the ceiling curved up so high it seemed to touch the stars themselves, and beings of every shape and size moved through the corridors, and some walked on two legs like humans while others floated or crawled or moved in ways that made no sense to human eyes. A tall being with blue skin and 4 arms approached them and spoke in perfect English through a translation device that hung around its neck, and it said that it was Guide Vel, and it would escort them to the council chamber, and Jake thanked it, and they followed as it led them through corridors that seemed to shift and change as they walked, and Lisa whispered that the station was using dimensional folding technology, and Jake nodded, but he was too nervous to really understand what that meant. They entered the council chamber, and Jake had to stop himself from gasping because the room was enormous and representatives from 47 different species sat in curved rows that rose up like an amphitheater, and at the center was a platform where the human delegation would make their case, and Jake walked forward with Lisa and Peter following, and he could feel thousands of eyes watching them, and some of those eyes were nothing like human eyes at all. The chairman called the session to order, and its voice boomed through the chamber without any visible speakers, and it introduced the human delegation and invited Jake to present humanity's application for council membership. And Jake stepped forward and began to speak, and he talked about Earth and the solar system, and how humanity had spread to Mars and the moons of Jupiter, and how they had developed fusion power and faster-than-light travel, and how they wanted to join the community of spacefaring species and contribute to galactic civilization. Lisa stepped forward next, and she activated a holographic display that showed human achievements in science and medicine and art and culture, and she spoke passionately about what humanity could offer and how eager they were to learn from older species and share what they had discovered. And Jake watched the council representatives as she spoke, and he saw some of them leaning forward with interest, but others looked bored or amused. When Lisa finished, there was a moment of silence, and then the Xanthari ambassador stood, and it was a creature that looked like a cross between a lizard and a bird, and it spoke in a voice that dripped with contempt, and it said that humanity was barely evolved from primitive apes, and that discovering fusion power was nothing special because most species did that within a few centuries of developing agriculture, and it said that humanity's 300 years in space was laughable compared to the Xanthari's 50,000-year spacefaring history. Other representatives began to speak, and none of them were kind, and a crystalline being called the Shardborn said that humans were too fragile and too short-lived to be useful members of the council, and an insectoid creature from the Kresh hives made clicking sounds that the translator rendered as mockery about human breeding rates, and how humans reproduce so slowly that they would be extinct before they could colonize even a fraction of their local cluster. The worst came from the Vol, and these were ancient beings of pure energy who had existed for millions of years, and they rarely spoke at council sessions. But one of them manifested as a glowing sphere of light, and it spoke in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, and it said that humanity was infantile and primitive, and that their consciousness was so limited and undeveloped that they could barely perceive 3 dimensions, let alone the higher realms where true civilization existed. Jake felt anger rising in his chest, but he kept his face calm, and he waited for the speakers to finish, and when they were done, the chairman asked if there were any who would speak in favor of humanity's application, and the chamber fell silent, and no one stood and no one spoke, and Jake realized that humanity had no allies here, and no one who would defend them. The vote came swiftly, and it was unanimous against humanity, and the chairman declared that humans were denied membership in the Galactic Council, and would be restricted to the outer territories far from the established trade routes and population centers, and humanity was forbidden from accessing the technological exchanges and the mutual defense pacts and all the benefits that came with council membership. Jake stood and he thanked the council for their consideration, and his voice was steady even though inside he felt humiliated and angry, and he said that humanity understood the decision and would abide by it and would continue to develop in the outer territories and would perhaps apply again in the future when they had proven themselves more worthy. Lisa gathered her materials and Jake could see tears in her eyes though she was trying to hide them. And Admiral Peter Cross put a hand on her shoulder and whispered something that Jake could not hear, and they turned to leave, and as they walked back through the chamber, Jake heard laughter, and he heard the representatives talking among themselves about the presumptuous humans who thought they deserved a place among the great civilizations. They made their way back to the shuttle in silence, and it was not until they were sealed inside and the station was shrinking behind them that Peter finally spoke, and he said in a quiet voice that the council would regret this, and Jake turned to look at him and saw something dangerous in the Admiral's eyes, and Peter said that humanity had been underestimated before, and it never ended well for those who did the underestimating. Lisa was still crying silently, and Jake sat beside her and told her that her presentation was perfect, and that the rejection had nothing to do with her work, and everything to do with the council's arrogance, and she nodded, but did not seem comforted. And Jake looked out the viewport at the stars and made a silent promise that humanity would prove itself and would earn the respect that the council refused to give. The shuttle carried them away from the station and back toward human space, and behind them, the Galactic Council continued with its business, and the representatives moved on to other matters, and within an hour, they had forgotten about the humans from the Sol system, and they returned to their debates about trade agreements and territorial disputes and all the concerns of species who believed themselves to be the masters of the galaxy. None of them knew that in 3 months everything would change, and that the laughter in the council chamber would be replaced by silence, and that the same humans they had mocked would be the only ones who could save them, and none of them could imagine that their arrogance would cost them everything. The council laughed at humanity until the stars fell. Silent Part 2. 3 months passed and humanity was settling into life in the outer territories, and Jake Morrison had returned to his duties as commander of the outer sector defense grid, and he tried not to think about the humiliation at the council station. But sometimes at night he would wake up, remembering the laughter and the contempt in those alien voices, and he would lie awake, wondering if humanity would ever be given a fair chance. The first reports came on a Tuesday morning, and they were confusing and incomplete, and the Drexen Confederacy had gone silent, and all communication channels were dead. And at first the council thought it was a technical problem or perhaps some kind of political uprising, but when they sent ships to investigate, what they found made no sense at all. The Xanthari fleet arrived at the Drexen homeworld, and they found the cities intact and the lights still burning and ships floating in perfect formation in orbit. But there was no one there, and the Xanthari captain sent teams down to the surface, and they walked through empty streets and entered homes where meals sat half-eaten on tables, and vehicles were stopped in the middle of roads with their engines still running, and there were no bodies, and no signs of violence, and no indication of where billions of beings had gone. The Xanthari searched for 3 days and found nothing, and they checked every city and every settlement and every ship in orbit, and everywhere it was the same and empty and abandoned and untouched but lifeless. And the fleet commander sent a detailed report back to the council and said that the entire Drexen species had simply vanished, and then the Xanthari fleet turned to head home, and they never arrived. Panic began to spread through the council chambers, and representatives demanded answers, and the chairman called for calm, but no one was listening, and species that had existed for thousands of years were terrified because something had erased the Drexen from existence and taken the Xanthari fleet, and no one knew what or how or why. The Vol were the next to investigate, and these ancient energy beings had powers that other species could not understand, and they could perceive across dimensions and see things that existed beyond normal space. And they traveled to the Drexen worlds, and they searched not just the physical realm but the higher dimensions as well, and what they found made them recoil in horror. The lead Vol sent one message back to the council, and it spoke of a void between thoughts and a silence that consumed consciousness, and it said that something old had awakened, and something terrible was moving through the galaxy. And then the Vol homeworld went silent, and when ships arrived to investigate, they found the same thing they had found at the Drexen worlds, and empty and pristine and lifeless. Species began to disappear one after another, and there was no pattern that anyone could see. And the powerful fell just as quickly as the weak, and the creche hives collapsed overnight, and their insectoid cities that had bustled with billions of workers stood empty and silent, and the crystalline shardborn shattered into dust and left nothing behind but glittering powder on their frozen worlds. The aquatic tideborn, who lived in vast underwater cities on ocean worlds, sent a desperate message saying they could feel something approaching, and then their transmissions cut off. And when investigators arrived, they found the oceans empty, and the water was still there and the cities were still there, but every living thing in those vast seas had vanished. The council sessions became increasingly desperate, and species that had been proud and arrogant now begged for solutions, and scientists and military leaders proposed theories and plans, but nothing worked, and nothing stopped the disappearances, and the entity or force or whatever it was continued to move through the galaxy, consuming entire civilizations. Jake Morrison heard about it through unofficial channels because humanity was not part of the council and received no official updates, but rumors spread fast through the outer territories, and independent traders brought stories of empty worlds and vanished species, and at first Jake thought it was exaggeration or fear, but as more reports came in, he realized that something unprecedented was happening. Lisa Grant contacted him from her research station on the edge of human space, and she had been tracking the disappearances and trying to find a pattern, and she told Jake that she had discovered something disturbing, and the vanishings followed. Ancient hyperspace lanes and routes that predated the current galactic civilizations, and she said it was as if something was using the Council's own infrastructure against them. The Council shrank from 47 species to 30 to 20 to 12, and the remaining representatives stopped arguing about trade and territory and focused entirely on survival. And they pooled their resources and their knowledge, and they sent fleets to try to find the threat and destroy it, but the fleets never came back. Ambassador Krell of the Vortan Empire was one of the survivors, and his species was known for being pragmatic and logical, and not given to emotion. But even Krell was afraid, and he watched as species that had existed for millions of years were erased in days or hours, and he realized that the Council was dying, and that soon his own species would be gone as well. The Vortan had a saying that pride was the luxury of the secure, and Krell had never been more insecure in his life. And he thought about the human delegation that had come 3 months ago, and how the Council had laughed at them and dismissed them and sent them away. And he thought about how humanity was still there in their outer territories going about their business, while ancient civilizations were being erased from existence. Krell made a decision that would have been unthinkable a few months earlier, and he accessed the communication system and sent an encrypted message to human space. And the message was brief and simple, and it contained only one word, and that word was help. The message traveled through space and reached the outer territories, and it was picked up by a deep space exploration vessel called the UES Pathfinder, and the ship's captain was a man named Danny Hayes, and he had been mapping asteroid fields. When the message came through, and at first he thought it was a mistake or a prank, but the encryption was genuine, and the source was verified, and the message was real. Danny immediately forwarded the message to Fleet Command on Earth, and he marked it as urgent, and he added his own note saying that this could be important, and then he waited, because there was nothing else he could do, and the Pathfinder was too far out to return quickly, and all he could do was continue his survey work and hope that someone with more authority would know what to do. Admiral Karen White received the message at Earth's orbital command, and she read it 3 times, and then she called an emergency meeting of the military council and civilian representatives, and they gathered in a secure conference room and debated what humanity's response should be. Some argued that the council had rejected humanity and mocked them, and now they should be left to face whatever threat had come for them, and it was not humanity's problem, and humanity should focus on protecting its own space and its own people, and let the arrogant aliens suffer the consequences of their pride. Others argued that humanity had a moral obligation to help, and that if entire civilizations were being destroyed, then eventually the threat would reach human space, and it would be better to face it alongside others than to wait and face it alone. And besides, helping the Council now would prove humanity's worth in a way that no presentation or application ever could. Greg Palmer was a civilian representative, and he had been a teacher before joining the government, and he spoke quietly but with conviction, and he said that humanity had always been defined by its compassion and its willingness to help those in need, and that if they turned their backs on the Council now, they would be no better than the species who had turned their backs on humanity. The debate went on for hours, and voices were raised and tempers flared, but eventually Admiral White called for silence, and she said that she would make the final decision, and everyone in the room turned to look at her, and she sat quietly for a long moment, and then she spoke. She said that humanity would respond, and that they would send ships and personnel to help the Council. And she said this was not because the Council deserved help, but because it was the right thing to do, and because whatever was destroying civilizations would not stop at the outer territories, and humanity needed to face it now, while there were still allies left to fight beside. Commander Jake Morrison was in his quarters when he received the orders, and he read them twice and felt a mixture of emotions, and part of him was glad that humanity would get a chance to prove itself, but another part of him remembered the laughter in the Council chamber and wondered if they were making a mistake, helping species that had shown them nothing but contempt. But orders were orders, and Jake began preparing immediately, and he contacted Lisa Grant and asked if she would join the mission, and she agreed without hesitation, and they assembled a team of specialists and scientists and soldiers, and within a week, they were ready to depart. The Council laughed at humanity until the stars fell. Silent Part 3. The human fleet assembled at the edge of known space, and it consisted of 15 ships, and they were not the largest vessels in the galaxy, but they were fast and well-armed, and most importantly, they carried technology that the Council had never seen, because humanity had developed in isolation and had gone down different paths than the established civilizations. Commander Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the lead ship and watched as the other vessels took their positions, and beside him, Lisa Grant was reviewing data on her handheld device, and Lieutenant Alex Turner was coordinating with the other captains and making sure everyone understood the mission parameters. Alex was young and brilliant and known for thinking in ways that surprised even experienced officers, and Jake had specifically requested him for this mission because they were heading into unknown danger, and conventional thinking would not be enough, and they needed people who could adapt and improvise and see solutions where others saw only problems. The fleet jumped to hyperspace, and the journey to the Council station took 2 days, and during that time Lisa worked constantly analyzing every piece of data she could find about the disappearances, and she cross-referenced reports and tried to build a timeline, and Jake would find her in the research lab at all hours surrounded by holographic displays showing star charts and incident reports. When they emerged from hyperspace near the Council station, Jake was shocked by what he saw, and the massive structure that had seemed so impressive 3 months ago was now damaged and dark, and whole sections were without power, and debris floated in the surrounding space, and there was no traffic and no movement, and it looked like a dying thing. They received a transmission from Ambassador Krell, and his voice sounded tired and desperate, and he thanked them for coming and gave them docking coordinates, and Jake ordered the fleet to maintain defensive positions while his ship approached the station alone because they did not know what they might be walking into, and he wanted the rest of the fleet ready to run if necessary. The docking procedure was rough because some of the automated systems were not working, and they had to manually align the ship, and when the airlock finally opened, Jake led a small team into the station, and what they found was heartbreaking. The corridors that had been full of life and activity were now almost empty, and the few beings they encountered looked haunted and afraid, and they moved quickly through the halls as if expecting something terrible to appear at any moment, and the lights flickered and there were sounds of damaged systems struggling to function. Ambassador Krell met them in what had once been a grand reception hall, and now looked shabby and neglected, and Krell was a tall being with gray skin and 3 eyes, and he looked older than he had in the recordings Jake had seen, and he approached the humans and stopped, and for a moment he just looked at them, and then he did something that shocked everyone present, and he bowed deeply and respectfully. He thanked them for coming, and his voice broke slightly as he spoke, and he said that only 3 species remained, and the Vortan and the Mantrin and the Forix and everyone else was gone, and he said that they had tried everything they could think of and nothing had worked, and they were desperate and terrified, and they did not expect to survive much longer. Jake asked what they knew about the threat, and Krell led them to a central chamber where the surviving council members had gathered, and there were perhaps 20 beings in total, and they looked at the humans with expressions that ranged from hope to suspicion, and one of the Mantrin representatives said that they called it the quieting. The Mantrin was an insectoid being smaller than the Kresh had been, and it spoke in rapid clicks and whistles that were translated by a device, and it explained that the quieting was ancient, and that references to it existed in precursor texts that predated modern civilization by millions of years, and the precursor species had sealed it away. But somehow the seal had weakened or failed. A Forex delegate added more information, and the Forex were reptilian beings with scales that changed color based on their emotions, and this one's scales kept shifting between gray and black, indicating fear, and it said that the quieting did not destroy in the conventional sense, and it did not leave ruins or bodies, and it simply erased and it removed species from existence as if they had never been. Lisa stepped forward and asked technical questions about how the quieting manifested, and what sensors had detected, and whether there were any patterns to the attacks, and the council members answered as best they could. But their knowledge was fragmentary and incomplete, and mostly they just knew that entire civilizations were vanishing. The group moved to a research facility deep in the station, and there, Lisa accessed the council's databases and began analyzing everything they had collected about the disappearances, and Jake watched her work and saw her eyes narrow as she found something, and she called him over and showed him the data. She had overlaid the disappearance incidents onto a map of psychic resonance, and the pattern was clear and undeniable. And the species that had disappeared first were the ones with the strongest mental presence and the most developed consciousness. And the ancient species like the vole had fallen immediately, while younger species had lasted longer. Lisa explained that psychic resonance was a measure of how strongly a species' collective consciousness registered in higher dimensions, and species that had evolved or engineered themselves to have greater mental powers showed up more brightly, and they were like beacons, and the quieting seemed to be drawn to them. Jake asked where humanity fell on that scale, and Lisa checked and then looked at him with an expression that was half surprise and half amusement, and she said that humans barely registered at all, and on the psychic resonance scale, humanity was almost invisible. She explained that most advanced species had opened their minds to the universe and had developed telepathy or other mental abilities, and they perceived reality in ways that went beyond physical senses, but humanity had gone the opposite direction, and human evolution had favored logic and skepticism and concrete thinking. Where other species had embraced cosmic consciousness, humanity had stayed grounded in material reality, and human minds were chaotic and undisciplined and shielded by thousands of years of scientific rationalism and doubt and questioning everything, and that made them almost impossible for the quieting to detect. Lieutenant Alex Turner was the first to laugh, and it was a bitter sound, and he said that the council had mocked humanity for being primitive and undeveloped, and for having limited consciousness, and now that primitive nature was the only thing keeping humans alive. Ambassador Krell looked at the data, and his scales shifted to a deep purple that indicated shame, and he said that the council had been fools, and that they had dismissed humanity for the very traits that now made humans unique and valuable, and he apologized for the mockery and the rejection. Jake accepted the apology, but he also said that apologies would not solve the current problem, and they needed to figure out how to stop the quieting before it erased the last survivors and eventually made its way to human space, because immunity was not the same as safety. The group spent hours discussing options, and Lisa proposed that they needed to study the quieting directly and learn how it functioned and whether it had any weaknesses, and Alex suggested that humanity could serve as bait because they could get close to it without being immediately erased. The council members were horrified by the idea, and they said it was suicide and that deliberately attracting the quieting was madness, but Alex pointed out that they were already dead if they did nothing, and at least this plan offered a chance to learn something useful. Jake considered the proposal, and he knew it was dangerous, but he also knew that Alex was right, and they had not come all this way just to watch the council die and wait for their turn, and if humanity could get close enough to study the quieting, then maybe they could find a way to stop it. He asked Lisa if she could build sensors that would capture data from close range, and she said she could, and she would need help from the council's scientists, but it was possible. And Jake asked Alex how he proposed to draw the quieting to a specific location, and Alex smiled grimly and said that they would use the council station itself as bait. The plan was insane and risky, but no one had a better idea. And Jake sent a message to Admiral Karen White on Earth explaining what they had learned and what they planned to do, and asking for reinforcements and authorization. The response came 12 hours later, and Admiral White approved the plan and said that additional ships were being prepared and that humanity's most experimental weapon was being loaded onto a transport and would arrive within a week, and she told Jake to be careful and to remember that the galaxy needed humans alive, not dead. Jake gathered his team and the surviving council members, and he laid out the plan, and he explained that they would position the human fleet at the threshold, which was an ancient hyperspace nexus, where all the major lanes converged, and they would activate powerful psychic amplifiers that the council had in storage and use them to create a beacon that would draw the quieting to them. When the quieting arrived, they would study it and scan it and learn everything they could, and then they would either find a way to fight it or... The council laughed at humanity until the stars fell. Silent Part 4. The human fleet waited at the threshold, and the space around them seemed normal and peaceful. But everyone knew that was about to change, and Jake Morrison paced his bridge while his crew worked at their stations in tense silence, and on other ships captains were doing the same and waiting for something they could not imagine. Lisa Grant was in the science base surrounded by equipment and monitors, and she had jury-rigged sensors using both human and council technology, and created something that should be able to peer into dimensional layers that humans normally could not perceive, and beside her 3 council scientists worked frantically making adjustments and running tests. Lieutenant Alex Turner coordinated the fleet positions and made sure every ship knew its role, and the plan was for the human vessels to form a loose sphere around the threshold, with the psychic amplifiers at the center, and when the quieting came, they would activate the amplifiers and draw it into the trap. Admiral Peter Cross had arrived with the reinforcements, and he commanded a group of 20 additional ships that formed a second defensive line, and his voice came over the communication channel steady and calm, and he told everyone that they were making history, and that whatever happened, humanity would be proud of them. The amplifiers activated with a hum that could be felt rather than heard, and they began broadcasting psychic energy across multiple dimensions, and Lisa watched her readings spike, and she reported that the signal was strong and clear, and if the quieting was anywhere in this sector, it would detect them. They did not have to wait long, and the first sign was a darkening at the edge of sensor range, and it was not darkness in the normal sense, because light still existed there, but it was an absence of something fundamental, and Lisa called out coordinates, and Jake ordered all ships to battle stations. The quieting manifested as a void, and as it came closer, Jake could see it on the view screen, and it was wrong in ways that hurt to look at, and it was like reality itself had been cut away, and there was nothing underneath, and ships that drifted too close to its edge simply stopped, and their lights went out and their crews vanished. Lisa's sensors screamed with data, and she and her team worked frantically to record everything and analyze it in real time, and what they saw made her blood run cold, because the quieting was not a creature or an entity in any conventional sense, and it existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously, and where it touched normal space, it consumed not just matter, but consciousness itself. Jake ordered the fleet to maintain position and not to approach too closely, and the human ships held their formation even as the void expanded and came closer, and he could see on his displays that some of the newer crew members were panicking. And he broadcast a message telling everyone to stay calm and focus on their tasks and keep their minds busy. That last part was crucial because Lisa had discovered something important, and she reported that the quieting seemed to target active conscious thought, and beings who were focused on narrow tasks or following specific procedures were harder for it to grasp than beings who let their minds wander or opened themselves to broader awareness. Alex immediately broadcast new orders and told every ship to have their crews recite multiplication tables, or run equipment diagnostics, or do anything that would keep their minds occupied and focused, and it seemed absurd, but it worked, and ships whose crews followed the instructions lasted longer near the void than those who did not. The quieting continued to expand, and quantum probes were launched, and they flew into the void transmitting data until they crossed some threshold and ceased to exist, and Lisa captured terabytes of information, and her screens filled with equations and dimensional mappings and energy signatures. She made a breakthrough and called Jake over and showed him what she had found. And the quieting was not attacking them. And it was not hunting or destroying, and instead it was drawn to consciousness the way a drowning person is drawn to light. And it consumed other minds because it was desperately seeking something. Lisa explained that the dimensional signatures suggested the quieting had once been alive, and not just one being but millions or billions, and they had existed in multiple dimensions, and they had tried to transcend physical reality entirely, and something had gone wrong and they had become trapped between dimensions. The precursor species had not been destroyed by some outside force, and they had destroyed themselves, and their attempt at transcendence had failed catastrophically and left them screaming in a void between realities, and over millions of years that screaming absence had become the quieting. Alex asked if the seal the ancient civilizations had created was meant to protect others from the quieting or to protect the quieting from its own suffering, and Lisa said she thought it was both, and the seal had been an act of mercy and a way to give the trapped consciousnesses peace, but the seal had failed. Jake realized they had a choice, and they could try to reinforce the seal and trap the precursor species for another million years of suffering, or they could try to end the quieting permanently and give those trapped consciousnesses the oblivion they seemed to be seeking. Admiral Peter Cross joined the conversation, and he asked Lisa if there was a way to end the quieting, and she looked at her data and ran calculations and finally said that the null field generator might work, and if they could create a dimensional collapse at the exact center of the quieting, it might fold the void in on itself and close it permanently. The problem was that the null field generator had to be activated from inside the void, and it required a conscious human mind to guide the collapse, because automated systems would cease to function the moment they crossed the threshold, and someone would have to fly into the quieting and stay conscious long enough to trigger the device. The bridge fell silent, and everyone understood what that meant, and whoever went into the void would not come back, and they would be erased along with the quieting and the precursor species, and Jake opened his mouth to volunteer. But before he could speak, another voice came over the communication channel. Captain Danny Hayes spoke from the Pathfinder and said that he would do it, and his ship was already the furthest out in the formation and closest to the void, and he had been the one to receive Ambassador Krell's original distress call, and it seemed fitting that he should see this through to the end. Jake immediately said no and tried to pull rank, but Danny was calm and insistent, and he pointed out that Jake was needed to command the fleet and coordinate with the Council survivors, and that Lisa was the only one who fully understood the science, and that Alex was needed for tactical planning, and that Danny was the explorer, not a commander, and this was what explorers did, and they went into the unknown, so others did not have to. Admiral Peter Cross listened to the argument, and finally he spoke and said that Danny was right, and that someone had to do it, and Danny had volunteered, and as painful as it was, they had to accept his decision, and Jake wanted to argue more, but he knew the Admiral was correct. Danny began preparing the Pathfinder, and the null field generator was transferred to his ship, and Lisa worked with him to set up the activation sequence, and she explained exactly what he needed to do, and when he needed to do it, and her voice kept breaking as she talked, and Danny listened carefully and asked questions and made sure he understood everything. The crew of the Pathfinder had to be evacuated because only Danny could make this trip, and his people protested and said they would go with him, but Danny ordered them to transfer to other ships, and eventually they obeyed, and one by one they hugged their captain and left, and soon Danny was alone on the Pathfinder except for the voice of Lisa Grant in his ear giving him final instructions. Greg Palmer was listening from Earth, and he had been following the mission through the communication relays, and now he spoke, and his voice was formal and heavy, and he said that on behalf of the civilian government and the people of Earth, he granted Danny Hayes full honors and recognition, and that Danny's family would be cared for, and his name would be remembered. Admiral Karen White added her own message, and she said that Danny was saving not just humanity, but the entire galaxy, and that his sacrifice would never be forgotten, and that songs would be sung about what he was doing, and Danny laughed a little, and said he had never been much for singing, but he appreciated the thought. Jake Morrison was the last to speak privately with Danny, and they had known each other for years, and had served together on 3 different missions, and Jake did not know what to say, and finally he just said, "Thank you." And Danny replied that someone had to do it, and he was glad it was him because at least he got to go out doing something that mattered. The Pathfinder detached from the fleet and began moving toward the void, and Danny kept up a steady stream of communication describing what he was seeing and how the ship was handling, and he tried to sound casual and light, but everyone could hear the fear underneath. As the ship approached the edge of the quieting, the sensors began to fail and the lights flickered, and Danny reported that he could feel something pressing against his mind, and it was like drowning in silence, and he began reciting the multiplication tables that Alex had suggested, and it helped a little. The Pathfinder crossed the threshold, and for a moment there was silence, and then Danny's voice came back faint and distorted, and the Council laughed at humanity until the stars fell. Silent Part 5. The fleet floated in space where the quieting had been, and no one spoke and no one moved, and they all stared at the emptiness where Danny Hayes had disappeared, and Jake Morrison felt tears on his face and did not bother to wipe them away, and around him his crew was silent and grieving. Lisa Grant sat in the science base surrounded by data that proved the quieting was gone, and the dimensional collapse had worked perfectly, and the void had sealed itself, and the trapped consciousnesses had finally found peace. But she could not stop thinking about Danny's last words and how calm he had sounded and how brave. Lieutenant Alex Turner had already begun coordinating the fleet's return to the council station, and he worked mechanically and efficiently and kept his mind busy because if he stopped working, he would have to think about the fact that a good man had just died, and he was not ready to face that yet. Admiral Peter Cross addressed the fleet, and his voice was steady but heavy, and he said that they had won a great victory, and that the galaxy was safe, and that Captain Danny Hayes had given his life to save billions of beings across hundreds of species, and that humanity would never forget what he had done, and neither should anyone else. The journey back to the council station took a day, and during that time the human crews held memorial services and shared stories about Danny, and many of them had never met him, but they felt the loss anyway because he had been one of them, and he had done what humans did best, and he had stepped forward when others could not. When the fleet arrived at the station, they found that news of the quieting's defeat had already spread, and the surviving council members were waiting, and Ambassador Krell stood at the airlock with the other Vortan and Mantran and Forex representatives. And when Jake emerged, they all bowed deeply and stayed bowed until Jake told them to rise. Krell spoke, and his voice was thick with emotion, and he said that the council owed humanity a debt that could never be repaid, and that one human had sacrificed himself to save species that had mocked and rejected his people, and that such courage and compassion was beyond anything the council had ever witnessed. The memorial service was held in the main council chamber, and it was the first time humans had been invited to enter that space since their rejection 3 months earlier, and the chamber that had once held 47 species now held only 3. Plus the humans and the emptiness was a reminder of what had been lost. Jake Morrison stood at the central platform where he had stood during humanity's application, and he spoke about Danny Hayes, and he told the assembled beings that Danny had been an explorer and a scientist and a friend, and that he had loved the stars and had dreamed of seeing what lay beyond the known galaxy. Lisa Grant added her own words, and she said that Danny had made the ultimate discovery, and had learned what lay at the heart of the cosmic mystery, and had found a way to bring peace to beings who had suffered for millions of years, and that his sacrifice had meaning and purpose and had saved countless lives. The council members spoke one by one, and they honored Danny's memory, and they apologized for their earlier treatment of humanity, and they acknowledged that they had been blinded by pride and arrogance, and that they had judged humans unfairly, and dismissed them for traits that turned out to be strengths. Ambassador Krell made a formal motion, and he proposed that humanity be granted full membership in the Galactic Council immediately and without the usual probationary period, and he said that humanity had more than earned their place, and that the Council needed human wisdom and human courage and human compassion. The vote was unanimous, and Jake Morrison accepted on behalf of humanity, and he did not feel the triumph he had expected to feel 3 months ago, and instead, he felt only sadness and loss and the weight of responsibility, because humanity was now part of something larger, and they would be expected to help others the way Danny had helped. The following weeks were busy with practical matters, and human ships helped repair the council station, and human engineers worked alongside Vortan and Mantran technicians, and they shared knowledge and techniques, and slowly the station began to function properly again. Lisa Grant presented her findings to the council's archives, and she gave them everything she had learned about the quieting and the precursor species and the dimensional collapse, and she held nothing back because some knowledge was too important to keep secret, and the galaxy needed to understand what had happened. The data was distributed to research institutions across all surviving species, and scientists began studying it and learning from it, and they discovered things about dimensional physics and consciousness that they had never known before. And Lisa's work became the foundation for an entirely new field of study. Jake Morrison returned to Earth for a brief visit, and he met with Admiral Karen White and civilian leaders, and they discussed humanity's new role in the galaxy and the responsibilities that came with council membership, and Jake was exhausted and grieving, but he also felt a sense of purpose. He attended a ceremony at Danny's childhood home and met Danny's parents and his sister, and they were proud and heartbroken, and Jake told them everything he could about their son's last moments, and how brave he had been, and how much he had mattered. And they thanked him and asked him to take care of the stars that Danny had loved so much. 6 months after the Quieting's defeat, the Galactic Council formally reconvened and the chamber was still mostly empty, but there were humans present now, and they sat alongside the Vortan and Mantran and Forex, and together they began the work of rebuilding galactic civilization. Ambassador Krell proposed a new structure for the council, and he said that the old ways had failed and that pride and arrogance had nearly destroyed everything, and that the council needed to be rebuilt on principles of humility and cooperation and mutual respect. Jake Morrison was appointed as humanity's permanent representative, and he accepted the position, though he would have preferred to return to military service, and he moved into quarters on the council station and began learning the complex politics and procedures of galactic governance. One of his first proposals was to establish a memorial for all the species that had been lost to the Quieting, and he wanted a place where beings could come to remember and grieve and honor those who had been erased, and the council agreed, and work began on a monument near the station. The monument was simple and elegant, and it consisted of 44 pillars representing the lost species, and at the center was a single human ship cast in metal, and it was a representation of the Pathfinder, and beneath it was a plaque with Danny Hayes' name and his final transmission. The inscription read, "See you on the other side and keep the lights on," and it became tradition for ships leaving the council station to repeat those words before jumping to hyperspace, and it was a way of remembering and honoring the sacrifice that had saved them all. Human culture began to spread through the surviving species, and the Vortan developed a taste for human music, and the Mantran were fascinated by human literature, and the Forex enjoyed human food, and there was a blending of traditions and ideas that created something new. Lisa Grant stayed on the council station as chief scientific advisor, and she worked with researchers from other species, and together they made discoveries that advanced everyone's understanding of the universe, and she published papers and gave lectures and trained a new generation of scientists. Lieutenant Alex Turner received a promotion and became Captain Alex Turner, and he commanded a mixed-species fleet that patrolled the borders and kept the peace, and his reputation for unconventional thinking made him popular with crews from different worlds who appreciated his willingness to listen to new ideas. Admiral Peter Cross retired after 40 years of service, and he returned to Earth, but he stayed involved in galactic affairs, and he advised new commanders and politicians, and he became a living link between humanity's past and its future. Admiral Karen White took over as Supreme Commander of Human Military Forces, and she oversaw the integration of human and council defensive systems, and she ensured that humanity remained strong enough to protect itself, while also being a reliable ally. 2 others. Greg Palmer continued his work as a civilian representative, and he focused on cultural exchange and education, and he established programs that brought young humans to the council station and young aliens to Earth, and he believed that understanding between species would prevent future conflicts. The galaxy slowly healed and trade routes reopened and new colonies were established, and species that had been isolated in fear began to venture out again, and everywhere there were signs of renewal and hope. Jake Morrison served as humanity's representative for 20 years, and he negotiated treaties and resolved disputes and built relationships with beings from across the galaxy, and he never forgot why he was there and who had made it possible. On the 20th anniversary of the Quieting's defeat, Jake stood at the memorial and looked at the metal ship that represented the Pathfinder, and he thought about Danny Hayes and about all the humans throughout history who had sacrificed themselves for others. He thought about how the Council had laughed at humanity and had dismissed them as primitive and inferior and how wrong they had been, and he thought about how humanity had responded not with anger or revenge, but with compassion and courage.